Well, hello, everybody. My name is David Kennedy, and I'm the former co-founding director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. And the Bill Lane Center is very happy to be hosting this program today. It's the second installment in the Center's Arts West program that we've sponsored this fall quarter. And today we're very pleased to have with us Richard White, who is my fellow co-founding director of the Bill Lane Center, and Jesse Amble White. And yes, there is a relationship between those two Whites. It's actually pretty straightforward. It's father and son. They are the co-authors of this new book, California Exposures, Envisioning Myth and History. And we're going to have a conversation about that between the two of them. And we welcome your questions, which you can submit in the Q&A or question and answer function on your Zoom device at any time. You can, starting right now. And we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can muster in the time we have available, which is 1 hour. So let me begin by introducing our two principals today. Richard White, as I've already mentioned, was, along with yours truly, the co-founder of the Bill Lane Center for the American West some decade and a half and more ago. Richard has long enjoyed a reputation as the premier historian of the American West. He joined the Stanford faculty just about a quarter of a century ago. Just recently retired from full-time faculty engagement. He's the author of many books. I won't mention them all, but I will mention one prominently. It's entitled The Republic for Which It Stands, which is a volume in the Oxford History of the United States, which I've had the privilege of editing, that entire series. And Richard's is one of the most distinguished entries in that series. Richard is a two-time Pulitzer finalist. He's a MacArthur Genius Fellow, and I mention again, a co-founder of the Bill Lane Center for the American West. Jesse Amble White is a landscape and documentary photographer and freelance film industry worker. He studied at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and he currently lives in Los Angeles, California, and is a self-described exhausted, I might say COVIDized exhausted father of 2-year-old Sophia, who may or may not make an appearance in this broadcast. And Jesse's work is currently available for viewing at Zocalo Public Square or at jesseawhitephotography.com. This program is being recorded, as those of you who tuned in a little bit early probably have already heard, and it will be available to all registered people who register for this session, even if they're not live with us today, later this week. So I'd like to begin with a pretty straightforward question. I guess it's of the chicken and egg variety. And there's one chicken and egg question to which the answer is obvious. That's father and son. That's not the question I'm trying to get at here. But just how did this book, which is a hybrid version, a hybrid collection of both photographs and text, or narrative and analytic history, which came first, the photographs or the history? Whose idea was this? Exactly how did the two of you put the concept of the book together, and how did you go about actually producing it? So Richard, do you want to begin?
Sure, I'll begin. The first part of the question is the easiest part, and that's the photographs came first. As we're going to explain today, this is a book driven by the photographs. And in the origins, I'll let Jesse tell you about how the book incubated from a very unlikely start, but what I'll talk about is the relationship between the photographs and the text. This is a book unlike anything I've ever written before, and it's not any desire to claim originality. It's really unlike anything I've ever read. One of the hard things about marketing a book like this is it doesn't really fit into any of the usual rubrics of publishing. What makes it unique is the relationship between the image and the text. The photographs in this book are not illustrations. The photographs are really driving the text. And the best way to explain that is, and it didn't occur to me till we were well into making this book, is years ago I worked on The West, the Ken Burns documentary, and I became fascinated with how Jeff Ward, the writer, wrote text for a documentary series, which is pretty much images on a screen. And I told him at one point, I think I figured it out, is that there are no topic sentences. And he stopped and he thought about that for a second. And he said, no, that's wrong. He said, the photographs are the topic sentences. And I realized that's what Jesse and I are doing. The genesis of the book is in the photographs. I work off the photographs. In those photographs are going to be the story. And that story is simply going to be what I can parse out from the photographs in ways that I'll explain to you today. My contribution, besides the research and writing, was the insistence that all photographs are really historical photographs. I'm going to share the screen now and bring this up. And that photographs that nobody would think of in the usual sense of being about history, my argument is they are only about history, because everything in the frame existed for varying lengths of time before the often now metaphorical shutter ever clicked. You look at a photograph like this, and you see the trailer, you see the flood, you see the storage vessels that are out there, you see a dike, you see the mountains. Everything was there before that photograph was taken. Everything there has a history. It originated at a certain time. It exists in a certain kind of relationship. And what my job is as a historian is to tease that out, and to tease that out into a set of stories that really illuminate the past. And you can make an argument, well, if all you're really saying is that the landscape itself always exists before we look at it, what do you need the photograph for? Well, you need the photograph because the photograph allows us to concentrate. They corral our attention away from the kind of flux of vision that we usually have. We see one thing, we see another thing, we're being diverted here and there. This allows us to concentrate, not rush off to the next scene. And in a sense, this book then is going to be an extended exercise in slowing down, expanding a lived experience and recovering context. I believe you can not only see the past, but that much of the time, that is all that we ever see. When our collaboration was well underway, I bet Jesse that if he took photographs, landscape photographs of a discrete set of places, I could turn those books into a history of California. That bet is part of the origins of the book. I lost the bet. This is a book about California, but it hardly takes in all of California history. It doesn't take in all of the state. It doesn't take in the entire history. But before discussing what it does do, what it does bring in, let me turn this over to Jesse to explain the origins of the project and get my screen off and his screen on.
Yeah, really, this is about, need to see here. Two things. It was, for me personally, it was learning to photograph what's left behind and also what's no longer there. The project started, I was on my way to San Francisco. I was stuck in traffic. I decided to take the ferry out of Vallejo. Left Vallejo, on the ferry, I see Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And if I could have jumped off the ferry right then, I would have to get to it. But I went back the next day and I was fascinated and obsessed. This is during the recession, Vallejo's bankrupt. Mare Island is wide open. It is a photographic dream. The only thing that's going on there is the shipbreaking of the Sensu Bay mothball fleet, which, you know, again, was part of an obsession of mine as a child. You can see there. So I was, like I said, taken with Mare Island. In terms of photographically, it's abandoned. It's wide open. It's 100 years of architecture. It's a time capsule left to the elements. It's a festival of rust and chip paint and decay. It was my dream. I went back every day, as often as I could. And then I sent the pictures to my father, and that's when we did our first story together. And I wanted to do more, so we went to, my dad's always been obsessed with Ranch D in Point Reyes. Ranch D was very similar. It's also abandoned. It's more personal. These are more Mare Island, excuse me. It's sort of a haunted place, but it was very similar to Mare Island. It was easy, it was simple, there was an easy subject. But it wasn't until we left the ranch that things got more complicated for me as a photographer, in that learning to photograph what is no longer there. I mean, Drake's Bay is there. The subject is unclear if when you're looking for Drake or whatever it may be. I didn't know what I was looking for at the time, and this is where it got complicated for me personally. In my journey, is I didn't know how to photograph what wasn't there anymore, and I don't think there was a better example of this than Tulare Lake in the Central Valley. You've all probably driven by it 1,000 times and never noticed it. If you know where the cows are on I-5, it starts there and goes south to Kern County. It is vast and empty, and the subject matter is unclear. Was unclear to me. So I mean, I would consult maps and satellite pictures, and you could see it quite clearly on a satellite, but when you get out there, this is what you're presented with. Is a lake bed looks a lot like the modern agricultural machine. I mean, it's just, I would send my father picture after picture that looked like this, and you found them useless, pretty much. I mean, trying to capture the vastness and the emptiness of it there isn't a lens large enough to get it and really explain what it is. So I had to learn how to be more focused, if you will, in my approach. I went back to my old tricks, which are decay and stuff. My father didn't find these useful either.
I wouldn't say I didn't find them useful.
Yeah. I mean, it was simple. You know, I went with what I knew how to do at the time, and it wasn't until I had to be more focused and learn what was around me. And so I started, and you start to see what it is now, and it's more of the agricultural machine, but that's what it exists as now. And then you start to look at what's natural about it. There's a native oak in a field of almond orchards. Almond orchards are a huge theme in this. You start to see what was there, and you start to learn to train your eye on what stands out from in the emptiness. And it could be natural. It could be the monument to the massacre there is in the middle of yet another almond orchard. There's the silos of what was there before in an almond orchard. So I guess you learn to focus on what stands out when you're in emptiness and anything, and then you realize that is part of the history, or at least it gives you a subject matter, if you will, from my perspective. And then that's when it started to move forward a little more for us, or at least for me. I mean, there's the absurdity of a no fishing sign in the middle of what was a lake, and a no trespassing sign for, I don't know what distinguished that line, but I think, and then you get to the predominant theory there is the irony of the biggest subject you will find consistently is the effort to capture and contain water in a dry lake bed, which I found amusing. But so that was my process. I'm not know if I'm saying it quite well, but it was of learning how to photograph what's not there. I mean, this is all pictures of a lake in theory, but there is no lake. I mean, and you saw the picture my father had earlier of when the lake does come back, when the floods happen. So I don't know if that. So.
Yeah, I mean, that sets me up.
Well. And sometimes you wind up with something just beautiful and otherworldly, about it. So.
And again, this is a place where both of us became fascinated by. This is Tulare Lake, but it's only really one of the several places we talk about on the, I have to get my thing to advance, okay, in the book. One of the parts of the book is we had an incredible cartographer, Eric Steiner, and this is just the guide map to the book. But you can see this is the parts of California we look at, starting up around San Francisco Bay, going down to what had been Old Tulare Lake, particularly in Kings County, the missions in Los Angeles, and I moved back and forth through them through time. And one of the things that we end up doing, there are some of the photographs that Jesse showed you, were Drake's Bay, because at the beginning, what happens here is that Drake becomes part of what ends up fascinating me out of Jesse's photographs. One of the odd things about the book is after we published it, virtually every place we looked at has become a disaster, but that's partially because of what's happening in California. Drake was, nobody even heard of Drake. Now Drake's monument is one of the monuments they want to take down. This is a monument in Golden Gate Park, which nobody's ever sees, even though they pass within a few feet of it most of the time going up Presidio Drive. And it's to Sir Francis Drake. It's totally hidden by trees. The way we found it, and this is what we do with the photographs, came out of this photograph, which Jesse showed you, which is an old abandoned rowboat on Ranch D. And one of the things from this photograph, I began thinking, well, there's the boat. They abandoned it. What did they do with the boat? And so I followed the boat. We took the trail down to where they would launch the boats. And the boats would be what became Drake's Cove, where Drake was supposed to land. And out of that, I began to be concerned with Drake. And I uncovered one of the two master myths of early California. And one of them is the Drake myth, as I came to call it, which is the belief that, in fact, this is from the beginning. From the beginning, once Indian peoples contact Europeans, it's going to be English-speaking and Anglo-Saxon. It's about the Anglo-Saxon origin, supposedly, of California. But it, of course, is always going to be coupled with the second myth, which Jesse also photographed at San Gabriel Mission. And this one, this again is a disaster photograph. This has been ravaged by fire now. This is probably one of the last photographs that was taken of the inside of that church. They haven't determined yet whether it was arson or something else, but the inside of the church, after it was refurbished, went up in flames. So, but this also was about another myth. This is a myth of the missions, the mission myth, which I grew up with, which anybody my age grew up with in California. But all of them, the photographs lead me back to these kinds of stories, and it leads me back to linking them together. And the way I link these together is through a series of processes that really begin to show the development of California, the origins of the California dream and its limits. And the key argument in every single chapter is that all of these things are apparent in the modern landscape. You can photograph the past. The landscape reveals its history. It's all there. It's all right in front of you if you know how to look and if you know how to see it. I do this in part because I've become really conscious at my age of the failure of history. Most Americans do not know much about their history, and they do not care much about their history. Most Americans think that their history is irrelevant to them, even though their lives, their daily lives, are embedded in it in the most quotidian and basic ways. What I'm trying to do is, if you look around you, if you look at photographs, if you look at the world you live in, you will realize how embedded in your history you are, and that is really very important. Now, I'm not arguing that this is the only way of doing history. I wouldn't even claim that it's the best way of doing history. But I think it's a necessary way, because I think there is a sense in which we will never understand ourselves, and we won't understand our country, and we won't understand our dilemmas unless we are rooted in a past which really is all around us and will be there whether we like it or not. Now, to demonstrate the past, I had several techniques. Some of them are compatible for one photograph, some are compatible for another. In others, I would merge them all together. and one is simply to excavate. And this is a picture of Carquinez Straits. It's a picture that Jesse brought me because it just struck him. And we were working out of Mare Island. He went up Carquinez Straits a little bit from Mare Island, and he brought me back these. And he asked me what they were, and I had no idea what I was looking at there. What it dawned on me eventually is what I was looking at there was the remainder of what had been docks and piers. And around this photograph, I began to say, well, here is, in a sense, the history of a large slice of California that can be read out from this. What do you read out? Well, this is what it looked like when those docks and piers had warehouses and ships. This was the center of the California wheat trade, which was far more important than the California gold trade in the economy in the late 19th century. It became the place in which the Central Valley is developed. The wheat is dumped down into the Carquinez Straits, Port Acosta and Benicia on the two different sides of the straits, and it's going to be shipped out. It's also going to be the beginning of California's flour industry. This is a famous Carlton Watkins photograph. And you can see what I'm doing here is I'm not just using Jesse's photographs, not just connecting them with documents, I'm connecting his photographs with earlier photographs, so that all of these things become linked into a different kind of story. But it's more than that. As we go on in the chapters, the Carquinez Straits are going to be filled with debris that's washed down from hydraulic mining in the Sierras. It begins to change navigation. It begins to bury the bay. It begins to destroy the fisheries. So if you look at that picture in Carquinez Straits, you're not just looking at the wheat trade, you're looking at mining. You're looking at hydraulic mining. You're looking at incredible environmental devastation, which has consequences which go down to the present day in the bay. All of these things grow out of what appears to be just a bunch of wood sticking out of the bay. And this becomes one of the techniques. This is another point that a photograph that Jesse showed you. This one is going to be an abandoned silo near Guernsey. And Guernsey is a town which you won't find because it no longer exists. This is pretty much all that remains of Guernsey, but there really wasn't much there. If the first photograph, what I'm doing is becoming a historical archaeologist and excavating, this time I'm partially excavating, but I'm also doing something else too. I'm dismembering. I'm looking at a single part of the photograph, which fascinates me. And in this part, it's going to be that silo. What is that silo doing in the middle of what is a young almond orchard? What we can do, we use Google Maps, we use all kinds of things, but I can read back. I can date to you when those trees are planted. Those trees are going to be planted in the early 21st century, 2014 to those on the left, 2011, 12, and those to the right, because I can see that through Google Maps. I can see that before that, it was briefly in row crops, but I can keep peeling it back further and further. Well, what was there before that? Well, to have a silo, what you have to have is alfalfa, because that's what they're using it for. And alfalfa demands irrigation. And they're growing alfalfa for dairying. And I'm push it back to the early 20th century, and I begin to see this change in California agriculture. This silo existed so they could put in alfalfa for silage. Before that, it had largely been wheat, the kind of wheat that went to Carquinez Straits. And before that, it had been cattle. And before that, we found from old maps of the lake, this place was underwater. You were literally looking at the edges of what had been Tulare Lake. That out of that silo, I can begin to press it back further and further to recover a history. But I associate it with more than that. Well, the silage can only come in as you irrigate, and there are these beautiful maps that show the spans of irrigation as they come in the 19th century, and I begin to use the maps. You can see Tulare Lake down in the bottom, irrigation expanding, which allows silage to come in as it begins to press south. And that begins to show this other change, this growth of infrastructure, federal programs, state programs, all of this history which is coming out of simply a photograph of a silo. And one of the things we played with a lot, these are photographs Jesse might not want me to show. There's some we didn't use in the books. They're working photographs. One photograph would lead to another, you know, and I asked Jesse, well, what would happen? What would it look like at the top of that silo? Which of course, nobody's going to let us in to climb, but Jesse had a drone. So what we do is we have a drone and we go out and we look out, and we can look out and see what you would have seen from that silo. And what I begin to realize is what you're seeing is an event I knew something about, but not a lot about. You're looking at Muscle Slough. the Muscle Slough Massacre, which takes place as the central object in Frank Norris's The Octopus, one of the most famous California novels, the late 19th, early 20th century. But of course, in The Octopus, he totally mangles what happened at Muscle Slough, but Muscle Slough is there. That little monument off to the right is all that remains now of Muscle Slough and the memory of what went on there. Once there was more of a memory, and that memory goes back to the earlier photographs. What this is called is Tragedy Oak. It was a live oak which was near the site of the original massacre. It's where that monument now is. And even then, in the early 20th century, it is going to be an orchard, but it's an orchard not here, as in the older one with a silo, but with an oak, with a live oak, a valley oak in the middle of it. But the same kinds of pictures show up again and again. And that, of course, leads back to Stanford and Stanford University. The whole thing takes place, the massacre takes place, because the railroad has expanded through there, claiming that a 25-mile stub was the main line of the Southern Pacific, which of course it wasn't. The only reason they built it was to get the land. And that leads to the battle with the squatters and the speculators and the massacre, all of which I detail in the book. So this might seem an awful lot to pour out of just looking at a silo, but it is all there. You can make the connections. That whole history is still embedded in that landscape. And then there's this too. One of the things that fascinated both of us as we went through was these kinds of empty houses, which exist particularly in the Delta and the San Joaquin Valley, old abandoned farmhouses that just begin to not so much vanish. Some of them stay there, but some of them do vanish. I mean, Jesse got a very good eye for a while, because what you could tell is where a house once had been, because there'll be palm trees left there. Palm trees in the middle of no place in the San Joaquin Valley means that there was once a farmhouse there. But these kinds of things associated, I began to think, well, what about this? Why are there so many abandoned houses in the San Joaquin Valley and the Delta? And I found out in 1945, 21% of all the farmhouses in Kings County, where we spent a lot of time with Tulare Lake, were empty. By the 1940s, population had dropped in 26 of 58 California counties. We think of the 40s and 50s as when people flooded in. Well, people did flood in, but they certainly didn't flood into the Delta. They didn't flood into the San Joaquin Valley. And I began to think, well, what happened to these people? And that associated me with two writers, one of whom is famous and the other one isn't. That's Joan Didion, who I will come back to in a second, and Frank Lotta, who is a local historian who I came to have a great deal of respect for. And for them, these houses become this image of an older California, what they thought was a better California that was breaking up and going away. For Didion, it becomes this theme in much of her early work of this California of the native sons, of California before the suburbs, of California before all the immigrants like me and my family, that it was just a better place, the sense of California as loss and of nativeness. It's part of a breaking apart that Didion encapsulated in her famous essay on Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. She wrote about the atomization of California in particular, and the US in general. She talks about the old Sacramento she knew and how it broke up and went away. It's an essay I read first in the 1960s and then read again in writing this book. And to give you a sense of the book and how I play off of these memories, I rarely do this in a talk, but I'll read you a section of what I wrote about Didion here. And this is my reaction to Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Both readers and writings travel through time. I read this essay differently now than I did when I was 20. In the 1960s, I regarded it as an obvious attack on hippies and radicals, and since I was both, on me. I presumed I was one of the anonymous, quote, misplaced children, abandoned homes, and vandals who misspelled even the four-letter words they scrawled. We were the adolescents who, quote, drifted from city to city, torn cities, slewing off both the past and future as snakes shed their skins. Children who were never taught and would never learn the games that held society together, unquote. We were the evidence that, quote, at some point we had aborted ourselves and butchered the job, unquote. Rarely had we and I been denounced so eloquently. Before I ever recognized the essay as a lament for a true California, I understood that I did not recognize any California in it, certainly not my California. The Californians that I knew were not native to the place. They were part of its endless churning. This did not make them strangers, this made them Californians. What Didion lamented was not only people like me and my family, but the loss of the story she had told herself of a true California and the privileged place it provided her. As writers often do, she mistook the story she told, true California, for its subject, the state itself. People my parents' age who gleefully told me to read Slouching Through Bethlehem, presumably so that I could feel badly about myself, did not recognize the essay attacked them too. They were the new people, and they produced the hippies and the radicals. Didion regretted the entire post-World War II California migration that had turned ranches and orchards into subdivisions, familiar towns into identical suburbs, and replaced people like her family with people like us. What I didn't recognize, and neither I think did Didion at the time, was that Slouching Towards Bethlehem had traveled halfway to its own partial repudiation in another book she wrote, Where I Was From. When she wrote Slouching, a new California dream of endless middle-class expansion had replaced the true California of the native sons. That dream, embraced by Governor Edmund G. Brown and the Democratic Party, dominated the 1950s and 60s. It turned dark later in that decade when it joined true California as a story of decline, loss, and regret. Didion's stories seem at first distant from photographs of decaying houses and vanished homes, but they are not. Didion explained the darkness. What Didion did was think of a break in time, and Frank Latta did too. I'll treat that more briefly, but it's one of the most extraordinary manuscripts I have ever discovered. I was going through collections in the Huntington, and I found what was a 106-page letter Frank Latta wrote to his grandchildren. He wrote it literally in a couple of sittings, and he's explaining to his grandchildren who their father was on the eve of their father going to prison. And like Didion, it's a lament for the old California. What Latta does is talk about and blame the changes in California is what had led his son wrong. That really what had happened is that gender roles were changing. An old patriarchy was vanishing. It's a lament for that patriarchy. He tells his grandchildren, if your mother had married a man who would have made the decisions concerning jobs and business, the public would never have heard of a case such as your daddy's. If your daddy had married a woman who would have allowed him to be head of the family, he wouldn't be where he is now. You read Latta, you read Didion, California's been breaking up and falling apart ever since the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Didion wrote of the 60s that those years where no one at all seemed to have any memory or mooring, unquote, was in the light of the Lattas simply what was true of the 40s and the 50s too. And Didion and Latta have a particular resonance for me now when we're tempted to hit apocalyptic notes in the time that we live in. Historians, I think, are the least likely people to find ruptures in the past, least likely people to announce an approaching apocalypse. It's not that we're any shrewder than other people, but we've been inoculated by our working lives, which we have spent reading past claims of ruptures in the warp of time and of the coming of the apocalypse. We were confident that the apocalypse did not arrive in San Francisco and the Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s, and it did not arise as the patriarchal family declined in Central California in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. It probably hasn't arrived today, though again, sometimes that is hard to say. So I think I'll stop at that point.
Thank you, Richard and Jesse. We have some questions from our virtual audience that I want to put to you. I think the first one is probably best addressed to you, Jesse. One of our participants asks how conscious you are, how you think about matters of scale. The person asks in particular about some of your panoramic shots, especially of empty spaces, and then there'd be some detail that to which, especially your dad's writing, often directs our attention. So how, as a photographer, how do you think about issues of scale versus detail, how to weight the one against the other? What attracts your eye when you're trying to imagine what you're photographing?
I think that was one of the the biggest lessons for this book for me was what I was trying to say earlier about is how to photograph. Nothing, you know, I mean, something that's so vast, it's almost indescribable that when you're in that lake bed or so you have to find some detail to put it in scale, one, and also to give it to it's like looking, there needs to be a clue to work off of to find something in it to capture your interest. So it's the progression, and I'm not sure I ever fully succeeded in it in some photos, was trying to find one element in that photo that gave the photo purpose, gave it a mood, gave it structure, you know. And I think my dad was speaking to that about the silo and how that all takes out. But that was the most difficult place, and no place more so than the lake. I mean, the lake is just indescribably large when you're out there, and empty, and just very beautiful, but impossible to capture in one picture. So you need something that gives the picture purpose, and whether it be the water pumps or the silo or the lone native oak. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do out there is find it. You just have to be curious and observant. I mean, my father and I would joke about this when we would go together, that I would just pull the car over at the most random things and take a picture of them, and hundreds of them were wasted efforts. But you know, the oak tree, which was one of my favorite pictures, was just, it was the only thing out there that wasn't an almond tree, and it struck me. So that was the technique.
Jesse's right. It used to fascinate me because I could not figure out what he was taking a picture of. And I learned a lot by just looking at things through his eye.
There's a tradition of graphically illustrating the West, either through painting or photography. Go back to the likes of Albert Bierstadt, 19th century painter, or Ansel Adams, 20th century photographer, where just the scales of the landscape and the panoramic scale of it seems to arrest the attention of the artist, whether painter or photographer. And your photographs have some of that same preoccupation with scale and panorama, but the detail is different. I used to think, actually, I think I'm technically wrong, but I used to think that there were no people ever in Ansel Adams' photographs. I've since learned there are a few, but by and large, what he's famous for are paintings of these enormous landscapes or features of the landscape in which humans don't figure. There aren't many humans in your photographs either.
No, there's none. I don't think there's one. There's one where I snuck my dad in, far distance. You can find him. Yeah, and you can't take pictures in the Central Valley without consulting Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, you know, Minor White. All those people really serve to guide me on how to do this.
And partially, we also had the reason, if you take pictures of people, you need their permission.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Another of our participants, Kevin Hurl, who's been a fellow at the Lane Center and has worked a lot on John Steinbeck and others. He asked you, how would you compare this book to Steinbeck or Stegner or Page Stegner, Elliot Porter, other books that are in this general tradition of trying both visually and textually to capture the essence of this mythical state?
You know, I think for most of them, as I said at the beginning, that the illustrations follow the text, that the text comes first, and that what you're either going to choose an illustration or you're going to get somebody to illustrate it is going to be around the text. This one, we go in exactly the opposite direction, that there's nothing I would write about without starting in a photograph. Now, it's true that what we would do, as you could see from some of the drone photos, is one photo would suggest another photo, which would suggest another photo, but the origin is always going to be in that original photograph. And we're after, I think, what Steinbeck wanted to do and Stegner wanted to do, they had their story. I mean, their story, they knew what that was going to be. I did not know what my story was going to be. You know, these are the things in this book are things I've been a historian my whole life, but I didn't know much about the Drake stuff. I didn't know much at all. The mission stuff fascinated me because it wasn't so much the history of the missions, but the history of the mission myth that would bring it in. Tulare Lake, you know, I knew it existed, but I had no idea what had happened there. And one thing we hadn't talked about, which was going to be Indian peoples, native peoples, the Tachis, who I had never heard of. The Yokuts, they're a group of Yokuts. They're never written about, not very much in California history. That was an aspect of Indian history, a horrific aspect, which I knew very, very little about. So I did not know my story. I did not know my story until I started to see the photographs and had to explain the photographs. And I think that's what sets us apart. It's the way of proceeding is quite different. And I keep looking for analogies, but I have not really found one.
Yeah. I think that one of the overreaching themes of when I was taking all the photos is like, I'm always lost. I rarely know where I am. I mean, that was part of the process, is you're just exploring, you know, and that's, a lot of that's just being lost.
Philippe Cohen asks, are you familiar with the collection West of Last Chance by Brown and Harif? It's Kent Harif, I suppose. And Philippe suggests that they've done something similar about the Great Plains. I don't know that work. Do you? No,
hello, Philippe. But no, I don't know that one. You know, I'd be very interested in it because I have not seen anything. If it's taking out, just starting with the pictures and going out, if that's what it does, that's what we're trying to do. But no, I don't know that.
Here's a very practical question. Would you please show a copy of your book, that is, hold it up to the camera?
Yeah, I can do that.
And the inquirer wants to know, where is it available, because he wants to go to a bookstore, get his hands on it.
Yeah, well, if you can find a bookstore open, you could probably find it. But, excuse me. Otherwise, you know, it's available on Amazon, but the bookstores themselves are, the one thing I learned about this is never bring out a book in the middle of a pandemic that's not about a pandemic, or this time it could also be about Black Lives Matter or about Donald Trump. Short of that, I think it was probably the worst time to market a book in my whole life.
So since people have brought other books into the conversation here, I have to say, when I was reading your book, the two of you, at many points it reminded me of at least the tone of another recently published book that I just finished, Mark Ericks's The Dreamt Land, which is mostly about the Central Valley, but about California in general. And I'm kind of groping for words here, but there's something tonally, to me, comparable to the way you approach the subject, both visually and in text, and the way Mark Ericks does in text altogether. And as I say, I'm groping for the word or words to capture what I'm thinking or feeling about this, but nostalgia is not the right word. Regret, maybe. You used the word, Richard, apocalypse, but a sense of decline or loss or lamentation. The message is not upbeat. It's about a lot of things that never should have happened in the first place or went bad.
Yeah, the reason Mark Eric probably reminds you of it is the same way that any sort of book about the King of California would be another book that comes out of it, because we're writing about the same place. We're writing about a place that rarely gets written about. Kings County, Fresno County, the country around Bakersfield. It's drive-by country. You know, you see it from I-5. What we did is get off the freeway and get into the middle of it. And the history I found there is that's, you know, parts of the book I think can be sort of uplifting, but parts of this book are just incredibly horrific. If you look at Kings County, where Tulare Lake is now, that's the part of California which has mostly eradicated the original California more thoroughly than any place else. There's something like 2% of original species are left there. They tried to eradicate, and this is a word I don't usually use. I'm very careful not to use it in terms of genocide. It's one of the places where, in fact, genocide is the appropriate word for what happened to Indian peoples around there, at least the attempt of genocide. It's a place now where if you go and look at the poorest counties in California, you're looking at the areas we wrote about. But at the same time, when you have it, it's one of the things I do, when the original settlers come in, the descriptions are absolutely lyrical. The Central Valley in full flower, and it's how you go from one to the other, how it is people have found meaningful lives there. It took me a while to understand how somebody like Joan Didion, who grew up further north than that, around Sacramento, could have an affection for it. It seemed to me good riddance. But no, I began to understand that. But right now, it is still one of the most interesting places in California. It's one of the places, as I say, the most polluted place in California, the poorest place in California, the most Republican place in California. All of those things are there, and it's just fascinating how this all comes together. And as Jesse said, you know, we took a lot of trips, but you know, we spent a lot of time in an empty lake bed, which after a while, even I began to think was pretty strange, but there's something beautiful and fascinating about that place.
So other participants have asked, what got left on, metaphorically speaking, the cutting room floor? I mean, that's not so metaphorical when we talk about the photographs, but just in general, how did you choose these particular places? And essentially, it's the Bay Area, part of the Central Valley in Southern California. There are big pieces of California, not least of all the Sierra, for example, that have been historically interesting and much photographed, but they're not in this book. So how did you choose what to do? And were there other sites that you thought about but didn't actually get to, or what?
Yeah, I mean, the choosing was partially, you know, once Jesse took photographs and we had striking photographs, but clearly we didn't wander the whole state. And my sense was, can I write a history of California which doesn't just go over the same old ground again and again and again? I have Los Angeles in it, but I'm on the margins of Los Angeles. I'm in San Fernando, I'm in the San Gabriel Valley. I write about the Bay Area, but I'm writing about Point Reyes, Carquinez Straits. I'm writing about the Delta. I left out the Sierras, and the gold rush comes in because I didn't want to do yet another gold rush history. I didn't want to do just, okay, here's the kind of picture Ansel Adams might have taken, except we're not looking at the beautiful parts. I tried to leave out all the stuff, but if you want to see that stuff, you can get it. If you want to see places, a history of LA, which I'm fascinated by LA, you can get that in other places. These are places which don't count as California most often. These are places you glimpse from a bridge, you glimpse from a freeway, you see when you're flying over it. Those are the places I wanted to tell a story of, because I thought, in fact, they would tell a story of the state. And again, I didn't bring in the whole state, but I think I brought in a large part of the state from places you usually wouldn't look for it. Because the interesting thing is that many of the places by accident that we went to were the heart of 19th century California, when Los Angeles was a small town, leaving aside San Francisco, which was always the center of California till the earthquake. These other places were just critical places to understand the history. But yeah, we left out a lot, and I left out the places which are the most famous places, which is the kind of thing I tend to do.
Jesse, as you and your father have any disagreement about that, or argument about it, or any other matters, or was this an absolutely friction-free, perfectly aligned?
I think we each had places we were very interested in. Like I said, I was very interested in Mare Island. It was fascinating, and he tricked me into going to Ranch D to introduce me to other things that weren't so easy, which led to the others. I mean, there was a practical nature to it too. I mean, these pictures were not taken in one trip. I mean, I've been all over Lake Tulare. I mean, that's 7 years of photography out there, I think. And to do that, I mean, you have to pick places that we can get to, you know. So I think some of them were farther away, and we allowed that, and then we did the missions, because I live in Los Angeles, and I used to commute California. So these are all places that sort of worked within the realm of places I could get to too.
Yeah, and the cutting room floor part, the major part, which was originally going to be a central part of the book, which is still in the book but only marginal, is the Delta, which Jesse was fascinated with. And we had a lot of very good Delta pictures, but it became harder and harder to fit the Delta in without repeating themes that were showing up in other places. So I have a whole section on the Delta, and at one point, I imagined, and it'll still work, you know, if I live long enough, the Delta is going to be destroyed. It is going to go underwater. It cannot possibly survive. So what we are doing is taking the before picture in a disaster movie. And that's true of many places we have. We have a picture of Sepulveda Dam in Southern California. I know how these pictures are going to be used. You can bring them up and say, this is what it was before, this is what's happening, and this place is beyond saving. The delta is you are watching something where before the tidal wave sweeps in. It is New Orleans before the hurricane, and you know that, you sense it, you see those things. And I sold it partially to the editor, but after a while I began to be a little worried because my editor, who's from New York, spends an awful lot of time anticipating California disasters so they'll help sell a book, and that's not exactly what our intention was. But the disasters clearly from these photographs are waiting to happen. But I began to understand too, you know, Jesse has a romance of the Delta, which I'm not a romantic guy, but Jesse really does have a romance of the Delta. And I began partially to understand that as we began to drive through it. And he's also right, you know, you cannot go into the Delta before you're just lost. That's what you spend your time doing.
It's also the reason I got a drone was because when you're in the Delta, you're actually below the water a lot of time. I mean, that's the reason it's going to fail is these 100-year-old earthen dams, but it was impossible to photograph because the water was 20 feet above you and behind a levee, you know, so we had to learn to get higher, you know, to be able to see these things. So.
You know, as I read this book and look at the book, I don't know if it's proper to talk about reading a photograph, but as I take it on board, which I did with great fascination over the last weekend and more. And I recommend the book to anybody who's interested in California and photography and the way to think about history in really good and creative and critical ways. But I was struck by something, Richard, that as the book went on, got closer to the end, it seemed to me it got more personal. There was more of you on the page, and there was more reflection about your own life experience growing up, and the way you had to shed some of the illusions of your childhood. And it just spoke to me more personally than it did in the early pages. Was that your sense at all in writing it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I think it happens not so much naturally, but as it went on, and particularly as we came to Los Angeles sections, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I began to realize, I'm talking about other people's memories, well, a lot of these sites I have memories of too, and I'm trying to distinguish my own memories of what went on there. And my books do become more personal as I get older, when in fact I have something to say, that I'm not just a dispassionate historian, but that a lot of these places had deeper meanings in my life. That my mother became a more and more religious Catholic, and that these missions that I went to really had a great deal to say to me about my own family's experience. And so the missions, it was very hard not to write about the missions without writing about my mother, writing about my father, writing about myself as a child. I mean, I remember old Los Angeles. I remember Los Angeles, the pastoral Los Angeles before the orchards came down. I remember running through those orchards. And I'll write about that. I mean, if I can talk about this is the way development goes, I'll bring in my own experiences, my own memories of it. And then again, the last chapter is just, you know, life's weird. Because Jesse was living in the Byrne building in downtown Los Angeles, and the Byrne building is right across from the Bradbury building near the Central Market. And Bradbury building we always entered in because I was fascinated by the Bradbury building because it was inspired by the Edward Bellamy novel Looking Backwards, and it was this sort of utopian origin, but of course it becomes famous because it's a setting for the original Blade Runner, which makes it dystopian, so it goes from utopian to dystopian. But Jesse's, you know, remembered I had the Margaret Byrne chair the whole time I was at Stanford. And so he called me and said, you know, the building I'm in is by James Byrne. Could he be related to Margaret Byrne? I said, nah, it's a common name. But I looked it up, and in fact, James Byrne was Margaret Byrne's son. And James Byrne had endowed my chair. So I was, at that point, Jesse's living in the Byrne building. We're photographing across the street for the book, and my chair is being funded by James Byrne. I began to look into it because requirement of my chair is I had to have not a photograph, but a painting of Margaret Byrne, who's this imposing woman in this huge photograph, which is always rested against my bookshelves because it's so big that I didn't dare put it up on a wall, because when the earthquake does come, it would tumble down, and I did not want to be the person killed by the donor of his chair tumbling down on him. So it's rested there, and she's glared at me for 20 years. And I began to look into the chair, and the requirements for the chair turned out to be that I had to be by birth a citizen of the United States, educated in America, sympathetic with the Constitution and the laws of this country, and believe in the general plan of government as originally established by the Constitution. What I had was a nativist chair. I mean, I've been looking at the Anglo-Saxon myth, and all the time in my office, that's the origin of my chair. My chair is a monument to nativism, and that if that is what funded me during my whole time at Stanford to write books like this. So somebody who's saying what you have to do is to begin to look at the kinds of things all around you. I hadn't even looked at that painting. I had shown no curiosity about it, where it came from or what my chair was. And I wouldn't have unless my son, who's not a historian, notices this stuff and asks me, are these two things related? And of course I have the usual instinctive historian's answer, no, but then I have the usual instinctive historian reaction, well, maybe, I better check. So that's, yeah, it all became very personal at the end.
You know, two of the prior holders of that chair were Carl Degler, and before that, Thomas A. Bailey, and they're both gone, of course. I'd love to interrogate them, what they would think if they knew the full story of how the chair was created.
He left an identical chair to Berkeley, which Larry Levine had. And the reason I have the picture is the lawyer said her picture had to be displayed in a prominent place, or else all the money from my chair goes to Berkeley.
So look, I'm going to give the last question to Becky Blanchard. Becky, glad you're with us. Great to see your name pop up here. Hope you're doing well, but I'll just read your question and give it to you, Richard and or Jesse. As you're living through this season of mega fires, I wonder if your experience creating the book provided insight into how these fires might shape the landscape going forward. You look at news photos of those burned areas, what do you see and think about?
Well, you know, I know what I see, and I think this isn't going to surprise anybody in this audience. I think at Tulare Lake. Once you have events of this kind, and especially events which these fires probably will heal, but not if they're repeated. If the fires keep burning, what you're going to do is have a piece of landscape which is always going to be shaped by a past event. The past event in the Central Valley is the draining of what was once the second biggest lake in California. What you're experiencing now is that a landscape records that kind of history. These fires, in ways we can't be sure exactly what they're going to do, are going to change the landscape in fundamental ways. Probably 30, 40 years from now, people will drive through there, if we've ever brought this under control, and won't realize that what they're seeing is an artifact of what had happened here during our lifetimes. But my whole lesson is that's what we live in. We see a history, that everything we look at is a reaction to part of a historical past. That's the fires now are a present that is going to become a past, and when people in their presence look back, they're going to be looking at that kind of history. These fires, as everybody knows, they're not new, but they're on a scale we've never seen before, and they're clearly going to leave their mark.
Jesse, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the places we haven't talked about is the San Gabriel River played a role in the book as well. And the upper San Gabriel, I believe, just burned, you know. Yeah. But even in the photos, if you look closely, there's burn scars all over those pictures. So, yeah.
Well, you know, you talk about cliched images. You mentioned earlier landscape images, especially the mountains. Mm-hmm. I've been on several juries where we had to judge photographs. And I have to say, photographs of fires have a natural advantage. They're always dramatic and colorful and spooky and frightening. So Jesse, maybe you ought to get out there and start shooting.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to thank everybody for participating in this discussion today. And on behalf of the Bill Lane Center here at Stanford, I'm especially indebted to Jesse Amble White and Richard White for this wonderful book. And I encourage all of you to interrogate your local bookseller or get on Amazon and buy lots of copies. They make great Christmas gifts, among other things. So thanks to all of you, and stay well, everybody.